Greetings! How is everybody this evening? We're in pre-show mode just for a moment or two. Great to see some people coming on early and throwing some postcodes in the chat already. So I've recorded those and there'll be plenty of time to explore that a bit later. Hope everybody is well this Tuesday evening. It's pretty warm in many parts of Australia at the moment, 40 degrees plus for a few people. And of course, we had the storms. And I was talking to somebody down in the Illawarra who had a bit of a water feature unexpectedly. So it's pretty interesting. It's not so warm here, but not too bad actually. And low humidity. So generally, I like the lower temperatures. Now, just in terms of what's going on, of course, as normal, the dogs are here. Hopefully they'll be quiet through the show. Never quite know. Always risks noises off. So if we get those, we'll have to deal with them. And of course, the studio is set up. No guest tonight, just me. So it'll be me talking about the data that I have here, which I think will be quite an interesting conversation to have. And for those who've not seen the setup, we've got quite a sophisticated studio now. We've built it up over a number of years. So we've got the multi-view up here, we've got the chat, and we've got the various other screens that we use during the course of the show. We're monitoring the main output up there, and we're streaming to a separate device, which I'm controlling over to my left. So that's the way the studio works, and it's all pretty much automated. I just switch it from a few buttons, which means that I can talk and also hopefully control the show. But sometimes, as you know, things go wrong and we just roll with it. Great to see good numbers on there tonight already. We've got more than 225 views so far. And we haven't even started yet, so that's pretty good. And nice to see some regulars come back. Hi, Hammers. Good to see you there. And as Alison says, hammers, hammers, hammers. Very good. Interesting also discussion about crime, which we might touch on in the main show. Anyway, I think that's it. And we will come back to a conversation. And the screen for you, Bitcoin on the right says Bone Budget. Yeah, I've been watching Bitcoin. Interesting. Volatility. And let's take the pre-show off and we'll get started with the main show. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 21st of January 2025. Those of you who were observant last week will realize that I got it a year early. 2024. No, it's 2025. I've realized now. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on the show tonight. And we're going to have a conversation this evening about something which I think is really, really important, and that is the real world pressure on many households. The fact of the matter is that now, like it or not, we do have the situation where a number of households are in some difficulty. So I've called it the Great Australian Nightmare, a postcode deep dive. One of the reasons why I've used that is because I made a show the other day called the Great Australian Nightmare when I walked through some of the high-level analysis. And that show has gone extremely well. Now, whether it was the thumbnail, I used Grok actually to create that thumbnail there. But the point is that quite a few households are in some difficulty now, and with interest rates remaining high and with the cost of living remaining high, the pressures on many households are continuing to be a significant issue. So tonight we're going to explore that a little bit. And as normal, we're going to look at this from a couple of different lenses. Firstly, I'm going to spend a bit of time just on some of the broader economic data that's come out recently and touch on some of the thematics there. Secondly, I will just briefly recap some of the information that I shared in the Great Australian Nightmare show, just so that people who didn't see that catch up. But then I'm going to spend the bulk of the show going into the postcode level analysis that we've got here. And that means that you can throw a postcode at me and I can give you the pen picture of things like how much stress is there, what the mortgage returns are for investment properties, both gross and net, and those sorts of things. So what we can do is to form a little bit of a hypothesis about where there are pains and problems and what's driving them and what might be running ahead. So that's the agenda for tonight. Now, as always, in the chat, we do have a lot going on. I will just remind you, as I always do, that we don't provide specific financial or legal advice on the channel. It's the general conversation only. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw questions and comments in. If you'd like to get a question to me, if you use @Walk the World, that's going to show in my stream, and that means that I definitely will see your question. The trouble is that there are so many other things going on in the chat that I don't necessarily see all of them. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that if you want to get a question to the top of the list, you can use that, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. And we really appreciate those who support the channel via Patreon or via PayPal, or indeed via Super Chat. Really helps to keep the channel running. We don't do this for profit. We do this because we think there's a really important conversation to be had, and your support enables us to continue to make the show. So it is greatly appreciated. Right. So with that now done, I think what we should do is to begin to move the conversation forward. Thanks for your comment there about nice setup. It's like a pro gamer. Well, don't know about that, but it is set up deliberately for streaming, and specifically for managing the whole thing on my own. So that's quite powerful, but it's all, with power comes responsibility. If I push the wrong button, we can get ourselves into terrible, terrible trouble. Anyway, let's just move the conversation forward. So I think a good place to start is home prices. And this chart from AMP is actually quite a good place to start, because it gives you the long run view. And you can see there that we've had prices running and falling and running and falling. We had the first rate hike back in 2022, and we saw the prices, which were effectively dropping through COVID, rising. That was, of course, government stimulus, and coming off. And pretty much across the board now, we're seeing that home price growth is easing back. No surprise, perhaps, given the tighter lending standards, the borrowing capacity being trimmed and all of those things, and the cost of living more generally. We also know that the listings are a bit weaker. Sydney listings surge, point to weak automatic was a headline recently. And of course, the coverage of mortgage costs and how they're hitting home prices has now become quite a thing. It is interesting that the fact is that many people are struggling. High interest rates are starting to take more of a toll and keeping buyers sidelined. He said that's the AMP Chief Economist Shane Oliver. There's been a pickup in listings and a decline in clearance rates in line with that. Clearance rate is just above 50% going into the end of last year. That's a normal level associated with price falls. And he predicted, I think the prices will continue to fall. I suspect Sydney will probably fall further. And then he predicates it on, depends on rate cuts. The other factor just to bear in mind is we are seeing this continued brain drain. So one of the issues that many people are leaving, for example, Sydney and to an extent Melbourne, and going elsewhere. And we also know that we've got issues with power prices. The recent wholesale power price rises are significant and are looking as though they will continue to put pressure on households, and the power futures contracts are continuing to rise as well. I made a show the other day about that, and it is interesting and significant that cost of living pressures are still there, and a lot of them are being driven from power. Also, the ATO separately reported that they're going to use data matching techniques to catch landlords out, particularly those who perhaps should have declared and haven't declared. And one of the things that we are seeing is quite a leakage out of investment property. And we'll look at some of the reasons why that is as we go deep diving. I showed this the other day, and I want to come back to it just because, of course, the affordability question is a big deal. So here was a report that said a single Sydney-sider would need a before income, taxable income of $234,900. And even in other places around the country, it's definitely an issue. Affordability is a real significant issue. It's really, really bad. And we've also got this exit of investors, focusing specifically here on Melbourne, we're seeing effectively more people in the investment sector looking to list. We'll see that in the investor stress issue, as we'll come on to when we look at the data. Of course, the bank of mum and dad is still there, and there's been a bit of support for that recently in terms of people saying it's probably one of the main reasons why people are able to buy. But the fact is that the issue of the bank of mum and dad is not a one-way street. We are now also seeing, in some cases, some of those who've provided funds to kids struggling with their own finances, which is a problem. And the second is that those who actually did get those Siegel payments, well, they're about 3 times more likely to default in the subsequent 5 years because they've never got into the discipline necessarily of saving. So I do think there are some important issues. And in fact, I've had some inquiries from media recently about the latest Bank of Mum and Dad data. I'm going to run that next week to the end of this past year, and I'll make a show separately about that. But it is definitely not good. And one Berger made the point there as saying, I never received a Bank of Mum and Dad credit. No, of course, that's the point. A lot of people can't. And if you're not fortunate enough to be in that sector of the market with parents who are relatively well off, then it's really hard to get into the market at the moment. And just a couple of little factors just to sort of give us a context. Of course, there's a discussion about further hikes to health insurance costs. They rejected 6%, but there's going to be a further rise. And we've also got this issue, of course, the very confusing situation with the building approval processes. It's very hard to get stuff built, and that's another reason why the supply is a problem. So we've got pressure on households, we've got poor supply, we've got more listings coming on, and all of these factors together are really making it quite difficult to work out what's going on the ground. Now, that's why I think my surveys are really, really important. And what I want to do now is just briefly outline the method that we use and why this is an important thing that we're doing. Excuse me. It's important, of course, because it really gives a better context. Now, there's always this sort of story. The RBA faces tough decisions, but they say they can still cut rates. Other people said, well, yeah, the bond route won't derail the RBA plans to cut. But it is just worth highlighting that the recent jobs data was quite strong, and that perhaps will put a brake on what the RBA wants to do. On the other hand, we also know that there's some shenanigans going on with the reconfiguration of the decision board for the rate calls later in the year. Now, whether we get a lift in February or the next one, or whether in fact Alba goes to the country with rates as high as they are at the moment, we'll have to wait and see. There are very mixed views there. There are some people saying that rate cuts are likely, others saying unlikely. My own view is it's a bit of a line ball. If you were just driven by the economics, you probably wouldn't do it. But of course, it may well be that there are other issues in play. And the political force of government, who continues to lobby, and you may have seen recently Chalmers arguing significantly that, this market jobs versus non-market jobs thing is really a bit of a furphy, he says, because a lot of the money that's been thrown into the system has gone into the private sector as well as the public sector. But of course, if you look carefully, the NDS is one of those factors where public money flows in. There are a lot of private firms being supported from the NDIS. So the headline from Steve Hamilton that the public sector is strangling the economy to death, I think is still some merit to it. And that may be another break in terms of the RBA's ability to be able to actually cut rates soon. And for many people, the problem is that the time now is passing. I've always said that this is not something which people tip over into a problem in a month or two, unless there's some external fact like illness or divorce or separation or something. But for many people, they can they can carry on and carry on and carry on until they can't. And now the question is, are we at the point where for some people it's going to be we can't carry on? Well, I'm certainly seeing that in my surveys, and that's what I want to talk about now. Now, for those who've not seen it before, the model that we use is my core market model. I survey households on a continuous basis, 52,000. We put that information into our core market model. We've been running this since 2001. We can slice and dice the data all sorts of different ways to look at different geographies, different types of people, and even different types of property. We also take a view here in the model as to what might be happening ahead in terms of thinking about future directions of rates. And so we run scenarios. And we've put all this together, the stress data, the trajectory of price data, the buying and selling intentions data, the migration, the economic data, all goes into the core market model through our scenarios. And then we can look at things at a postcode level. We can roll it up to a region or state or an all-Australia level. And we can also form a view of scenarios ahead where prices might go based on what we see today. Now, what I'm going to do today is to focus down in at the postcode level because there are significant variations across postcodes. And a lot of the aggregate data that we see being presented specifically from some of the property portals, to my mind, is too aggregated. It's too high level to be really useful. So you need to go into the granularity down in postcodes. And at postcode level, you can see there some significant and sharp contrasts. Now, just before I get started, I will just make the point that I do provide one particular service here called my one-to-one service. And if you are interested in a more detailed deep dive, you can have an individual conversation with me about a particular postcode. I can't give financial advice, of course, but I can look at the underlying trends in the data at a granular level. And so I look at the stress data, the house price trends data, and form a view of where things may be going based on the modeling. Typically, this takes an hour or so, and we can do it via Zoom or a phone call. And there is a cost involved simply because, well, there's a lot of work to put it together. I produce a 35-page report for each of the conversations that we do, give or take a few pages. But if you are interested, we're booking ahead 3 to 5 weeks, and you can contact me by the DFA blog. There are links below to specifically refer to the one-to-one. So that is how you can engage with me specifically, as well as today, of course, which I'll be able to share postcode information. Now, just on the stress, let me just remind you again, there's a very important definitional thing here. I use cash flow, money in, money out. There are other definitions around 30% of income, although it's never clear whether it's taxable or gross income. Others use underwriting metrics, so the Roy Morgan analysis is more metrics-based, but we define stress simply as cash flow, money in, money out. So if households have more outgoings, excluding one-off discretion, like, for example, holidays, then you've got stress. If they have a mortgage, they're in mortgage stress. If renting, and rental stress. What it means is they're having to prioritize. They can't cover all of the things they want to do, so they're having to make hard decisions. If you're an investor with cash flow pressures, then you can be a stressed investor. And that gives me an aggregate roll-up for total financial stress. And we can look at both the percentage of households and the count. Now, percentages is interesting, but I think the count, the law of big numbers, is the most relevant for this conversation. RBA published this some time ago, and it's one that I come back to because it really helps to define this quite well. So they say that the spectrum of household financial stress runs from budget pressures at the mild end right the way through via missing payments to insolvency. I'm measuring stress at the mild end, the budget pressure end, and the journey between budget pressures at the mild end and insolvency or missing payments can be months or even years. So one of the very interesting examples of that is in Western Australia. What we are seeing there in Western Australia is that we've got households who were buying many years ago, were seeing prices drop, were seeing interest rates begin to rise, and some of the insolvency that we're still seeing now is happening from WA decisions taken 4, 5, 6 years ago. So there's a long-term connection between cash flow and household pressures and mortgage stress. But it doesn't mean that everyone's going to fall over tomorrow afternoon. But as I said earlier on, the problem is that as this thing drifts on, as we get more and more into a cash flow trap, where effectively incomes are not growing in real terms, well, they've not been growing for a decade, where the costs of living continue to rise, so inflation is still above target, And across the board, there are significant price rises, even for a number of things, from food through to power. And of course, with the inflationary pressures being stoked also by low exchange rates, potentially, we could see fuel prices, for example, petrol prices, begin to feed through into higher inflation too. So there's a lot of reason to be concerned. And interest rates remaining high, of course, putting pressure on those with a mortgage. Those in the rental sector are also being asked to pay more. And we'll see shortly that the rental sector is actually the one that's being most exposed. Now, if we then look in more detail at the results, now these results are to the end of December. And the first chart just shows you the trend. So you can see here, firstly, rental stress is at 76% of households in the rental sector have cash flow problems. And you can see the massive run up here from the early 2020s. There was always a pressure, but that pressure has really accelerated in recent times and is now sitting on a high plateau at more than 76%. If we then look at mortgage stress, they're about half of households, 50%, give or take, have cash flow pressures. The others are fine. But compare that with February 2020 before COVID, it was 32%. So you can see the significant acceleration there. And it's still sitting around half. The RBA reports the debt to income ratios, but it's a bit of a furphy because it includes all households, not just those with mortgages. So you really need to multiply it by 3. So it's, typical debt to income ratio is 5, 6 or 7 or even 8 or 9 times for some households. So it's pretty significant. Now, if we then look at the data for December briefly, you can see here that with mortgage stress at 50%, there is, in yellow, it's gone up from last month across New South Wales, the Northern Territory, Queensland, South Australia. It is back in the ACT, Tasmania, Victoria, Western Australia, but still over half. You can see there that rental stress rose in the ACT, South Australia, Tasmania, slipped back slightly in the other areas. Investor stress rose in New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, and Western Australia, and rose overall. And financial stress, which is the aggregate of all households, rose in New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, eased back very slightly in the other states, but we've still got 47.6% of households across the country in financial stress of all types. That's more than 4.7 million out of the 9.9 million households who are actually in the surveys. So that's how it works out. And if you then quickly look at the segmented view, you can see there that young growing families, including first-time buyers, have the highest levels of mortgage stress. You can see there that the first-generation Australians, those coming into the country, moving into the rental sector immediately, migrants, have the highest level of rental stress, although it's high across the board. And you can also see that more affluent households, so the exclusive professionals and indeed young affluents, together have higher levels of investor stress. No surprise, because they own the lion's share of investment property. And overall financial stress at 67.6% of young growing families is the highest. And that's about 500,000 households there who are actually in the highest levels of financial stress. But you can see there that other sectors are also impacted. And as one Burjo says, they are very high percentages. Yes, it is. And this is the point, really. It's been rising and significantly putting pressure on households. Now, like I say, when households get into difficulty, they don't immediately fall over. What they do is they dial back their spending. One of the reasons why the data from the ABS shows that spending is pretty contained. Although, of course, we saw recently that spending was up a little bit because there are still some others with significant ability to continue to spend. And so one of the other thematics in all of this is that not everybody's caught with this stress. There are significant pockets of high stress, but there are other areas where people are doing fine. And more affluent households generally are doing better, although they're more leveraged up. But we're also seeing some other areas where there are people with no mortgage and no rent, and they're doing quite well, actually, because they're still sitting on some of the government handouts that went post-COVID. So we have this patchwork. And the key message, I think, in this conversation at a higher level is we have a patchwork. Not everybody is equally impacted, but it does make the RBA's job difficult because they look on one hand at people struggling. They're looking also at people's capacity to spend, and are spending quite big. We're seeing some wage rises in some sectors of the economy now. Of course, public sector wage rises are still quite strong in some areas. And we're seeing significant growth in public sector employment too. So all of these factors are flowing in. And interestingly, if you look at private and public sector, you'll see that a lot of the stress that we're seeing is in the private sector rather than the public sector. So it's a complicated story. Now, when I did the earlier show, I also then went on to show you the top postcodes. I'm not going to go through this in detail today. If you need to pause and watch, you can see it here. But just to say that places like Liverpool, Campbelltown, Toowoomba and Wanneroo in significant levels of mortgage stress with 13,000 or 10,000 looking down the list and dropping down the list there. The characteristic, like these in Victoria, is a lot of these are high growth areas, a lot of new development, a lot of relatively newly mortgaged people. In terms of rental stress, you can see there that places like Cranbourne and Mandurah, Roxburgh, if you look at default, risk of default, Cranbourne, Mandurah, Roxburgh Park have the highest level of default. And interestingly, if you look in the percentages, these are quite big. Now, this is my prediction ahead. It's not necessarily what's happened. So what it's saying is if things don't change, we're going to see more defaults in these areas. And these numbers are not massively high, but high enough to be concerning. And again, some of these are high growth corridors. But the WA story is one, of course, of, as I said earlier on, the previous wave coming through and finally biting. If we look at more rental stress, you can see there that centre of Melbourne, Liverpool, Toowoomba, Southport, and Point Cook and Derrimut in Victoria are actually at the top of the list, 15,000, 14,000, 14,000. And you can see here high percentages as well. If you look at the story of investor stress, you can see a bit of a different story. So up in Queensland, we are seeing, for example, in Bundaberg, Toowoomba, Happy Valley, investors struggling to make sense of what's going on. And there is a limit to how high you can put rents up. Westmead, of course, Hornsby, DY, and Wembley and WA as well there. And overall financial stress, if you look at that, you can see there that Liverpool is at the top of the list with 28,000. That's 73% of households. Toowoomba with 27,000 or 56%. And Campbelltown in New South Wales at 76% or 22,000. And then we've got this run of 3029 and 3030, Tarnit, Derrimut, Cranbourne, centre of Melbourne, Ballarat, regional centre then Mount Druitt in New South Wales, Ipswich in Queensland, Westmead, Roxburgh Park. So here are the hot spots across the country. And it is worth, I think, highlighting that these numbers are quite significant in these postcodes, but not everybody is impacted even in those postcodes. Now, if we touch briefly on the scenarios, because the scenarios is quite an important factor in understanding what's going on, I use my scenarios to try and show the sensitivities. It's not predictions, it's sensitivities. And if you look at it, there are three. The best is the Goldilocks zone, where rates don't go higher. They fall later through 25. We see inflation coming down in line with RBA expectations. Wage rises are faster. We don't get a recession, and migration stays pretty much where it is. It's above average. The base case, soft landing, rates stay at 4.35, but inflation rises again and stays above target until 2026. Maybe that's the tariff issue from the US. Maybe it's the exchange rate. Maybe it's just high demand for property. Still no recession in Australia, but migration does begin to fall a bit. The worst case scenario is a nightmare scenario where we see higher rate rises through 25, putting rates for mortgages up higher. They start higher in 26 with inflation, unemployment rises, wage growth stalls because we start to see recessionary forces coming in. And whilst the RBA cuts, the fact is that it's too late. So we get significant pressures on households, and migration also drops below average. And that's important because it gives you some quite significant flavours. And here's just an example. In WA, prices growth in WA could be quite strong, up 18% over the next 36 months. Or it could be a bit of a fall in my base case scenario, down 1.3% over the next 3 years, cumulatively speaking. Or indeed, a more significant fall if things went pear-shaped. So it shows you that the significant sensitivity, and I could go through everywhere. If we look at units, it's similar. And if we then look at Victorian story, the Victoria story there is that even in the best case scenario, there's almost no price growth likely. But in the base case a fall, in the worst case a more significant fall, and of course units would follow on too. Now, in the earlier show, I did go through all of the areas of the country, and you can go and check that out if you'd like to. But the fact of the matter is that there are significant sensitivities on home prices. There is more of a bias now, I think, to a downturn in home prices relative to where we were recently. And that's going to have a significant impact on many households. It's interesting that even in the ACT, which of course you would expect to be quite well insulated because of the public sector jobs, in the ACT, the best case scenario there is only a small rise over the next 3 years, maybe 3%. But on the base case, a more significant fall, 16% over 3 years, and a worst case, down 36%. So there are significant sensitivities and pressures. And the point I'd want to make here is that the public sector is not insulated from this overall. Wherever you look, what you can see is that there are significant pressures. And those pressures continue to build. And when you put it all together, it's not surprising that we're seeing the listings rise that we're seeing. We're seeing the market slow. We're seeing people stepping back. And we're seeing people dial down their spending. And if you take the aggregate view, before I go into the detail, here is the All Australia view. So, there's about a best case scenario of 10% over 3 years growth across Australia on average, obviously state variations. The base case is a fall of about 9% over 3 years, and the worst case is a fall of 29%. So somewhere within these bounds is the likelihood of trajectory of prices. So there is absolutely no guarantee of continued price growth across the country at an aggregate level. Now, let me then move on, because I think it's worth just highlighting the fact now that we do detailed analysis. And this analysis allows us to deep dive into specific postcodes. And here is my famous slide. This is the one that I use to show the individual postcodes. This is actually the Wollongong postcode 2500, one I study very closely, I know it very well. And this is the one page of information that is available for every postcode across the country that I cover. Now, I don't cover some very small postcodes, but the bulk of it we do cover. And you can see here that we have information about the household mixture. So those owning outright, those borrowing, those renting. We've got information on the stress levels. We've got information on the property mixes. We've got information on the people ratios. In other words, how many people per house, the vacancy rates, the gross and net investment yields, and very importantly, the taxable income from both the ATO and also from the census data. And one of the little flags here is this multi, because if in fact you have the more than one income going on the mortgage, that shows as a multi-flag there. And we then have disposable monthly income and then the proportion of income going on the rent or on the mortgage. So that's how we do it. And that allows me then to look at individual postcodes in considerable detail and really go into a deep dive. Now, what we can then do is we can switch across and we can look then at the individual postcode that you might be interested. So this is the data view based on the model, but I then drill down into it, and here it is. So this is now a slightly bigger view without the chart, and you can see here that the information is now displayed there. But it also allows me then to put other requests in. Now, I had a postcode request for 4870 before we started, so we'll start with that one. And 4870 is in South Cairns. And interesting observation there is 29,000 households with 25% owning outright, 33% are borrowing, and 41% are renting. And that translates into quite a large number there. The mortgage stress is at 39% in mortgage stress, rental stress at 29%, stressed investors at 99.1%, and the overall financial stress metrics is 27%, which is not that high relative to some other places that we'll look at. Now, if we then look at the property mix, you can see there that 59% are houses, 25% are other types of units, and then we've got other types of property, which could be, for example, standalone cabins, or it could be under a shop, those sorts of things. Now, if we look then at the people ratio, it's 2.11. That is higher than some other postcodes. So you see some families rather than just individuals there. The vacancy rate was quite high. Now, that was based in the census that was done just around the time of COVID and beyond. And so that will reflect things like Airbnb and those sorts of things. Gross investment yields at 4.1%, but the net investment yield is flat. So what it means is that in real terms, investors are now struggling to make a return. That's because, of course, the costs of paying interest on a property has gone up because of high interest rates. And the fact also that the ability for people to continue to pay more higher rent is also very limited. It's capped by ability to pay. And that, of course, is directly linked to income. And talking about taxable income, the typical ATO for an individual is $67,000 there. For the household census, it's 78,000. So the multi-flag comes in, means that multiple incomes are going to pay the typical mortgage in this particular postcode. And the disposable monthly income is around $5,500 a month on average. And 34.4% is going on the typical mortgage payment at 1,920, and 27.7% going on the typical rent at 1,544. And I will say that, the 30% measure here of disposable monthly income is a bit of a flag. That's how I've put a little bit of a different color here. If we go with 30%, it then comes out in yellow here. Looking at the price scenarios, because of the relatively low levels of financial stress, there is still potential upside in this postcode for further price rises over the next 3 years. In the best case scenario, maybe up 19%. But the base case, which is perhaps more likely now, is a much lower level with a small rise this year and then a bit of a going sideways the next 2 years cumulative. The worst case, of course, a more significant fall. And if indeed units are, of course, important to look at as well, they tend to follow quite closely houses, but maybe not rise as much or fall quite as much when we see the movements from our scenarios. So that's that particular postcode, which gives you quite a good flavor. Now, there was another interesting discussion here about the impact of stress and crime is actually rising in Cairns. I do monitor crime in accordance with the publicly available information, and I do see correlation between high levels of stress and more crime, so that's something to bear in mind. Now, I had another postcode request for 4570, so let's go there now. And that was in the SA3 of Maryborough, and it was Mother Mountain. And here, and you can see here there's quite a lot of suburbs included here, 18,000 households with 41% owning outright and 36% borrowing and 21% renting. You can see there that the overall story on mortgage stress is 21%, but rental stress is extremely high. Now it says 100%, that's plus or minus a few percent, but it's showing it's very high. Investor stress is at 15% and the overall financial stress is at 35%, so it's higher than the other postcode. As a result of that, the price scenario shows, well, there is still some growth in the best case, so maybe 12% over 3 years, but the base case is a fall of about 7%, and the worst case a fall of about 27%. Most of the properties here are houses, small number of units, other types of property. People ratio is slightly higher, so again, it's going to be families, not just individuals. The vacancy rate's quite high. Maybe that's Airbnb, maybe that's holiday or second homes. Gross investment yields at 4.5. The net investment yield is positive, but only 0.5%. And I want to highlight the fact that the net investment yield is the really important thing to look at here. And that's because what we're doing here is the costs of the investment property in things of mortgage payments, management fees, maintenance, all of those things, relative to the income that's being generated from it. And whilst there's a theoretical return, sometimes there are vacancies in the property and those sorts of things too. Looking at the taxable income, the ATO said 55, the household census said 60, and that gives a disposable monthly around $4,000 with 39% going on the typical mortgage, 1,560, and 36% going on the typical rent at 1,470. And you can see there that the house prices may be doing okay depending on how things play out. But this mortgage stress story is quite significant, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a rise in investor stress because of the fact that the rental stress is so high. Okay, now I was also asked for postcode 3216. And this is in the Victorian state around Geelong in the Surf Code. And it's called Heighton. 24,300 there. 36% are owning outright, 37% are borrowing, and 26% are renting. We have 62% in mortgage stress, 82% in rental stress. We have 11% of stressed investors and 48% overall in financial stress. So you can see here, stress is rising. Looking at the property mix, 84% houses, small number of units, other types of property. We have a people ratio of 2.32, so again, quite high. Families, not just individuals. We have a vacancy rate of 5.8%. We have a gross investment yield of 3.2%, and we have a net investment yield of minus 0.9%. We'll see this often in Victorian postcodes with the negative impact of the higher interest rates, the fact that rents are up but not as up as they need to be able to cover the costs, and of course the other pressures being imposed by the Victorian state government on renters. Taxable income, 70,000. The household census said 89,000. So the multi-plat flag comes up. Multiple incomes potentially go on the mortgage. And that will give a disposable monthly around $6,000, with 34.3% going on the typical mortgage payment, more than $2,000, and 29.6% going on the typical rent at $1,794. On the scenarios, even the best case scenario is a small fall over the next 3 years, down 4% cumulative. The base case, a more significant fall, and the worst case, a very significant fall, and units tend to follow on, going in the same direction, but perhaps not quite so dynamically. So those were the ones that we received before we actually went live. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to have a little bit of a look and see what other ones people asked for. There was one here from Ed 3 months ago, 6401. Can you run some numbers? Sure can. So let's do 6401. Okay. And I'm going to take you back off screen now so we can see it. So here, smaller postcode count, 3,200 at the time. But we've got 37% owning outright, 34% of borrowing, and 28% of renting. The mortgage stress is at 41%. The rental stress is very high, close to 100. And the stressed investors at 27% puts the overall financial stress at 45%. So that's quite high. If you look at the mix of property, it's 93% houses, small number of units and other types of property. And the vacancy rate's very high at 15.9%. Now, that could be because it's second homes, it could be Airbnb, or it could be perhaps new properties being built but not yet occupied. Gross investment yield 3.8, net investment yield minus 1.1. So investors are taking a bit of a bath here at the moment. And looking at the taxable income, 65,000 from the ATO, 65,000 from the census. So there's consistency there. And that gives a disposable monthly around 4,700. With 32.8% or 1,560 going on the typical mortgage, and 26.2% going on the typical rent at 1,245. From a scenario perspective, well, the best case scenario over 3 years is still a price rise of about 8%, cumulatively speaking, but the base case is a bit of a fall accelerating in year 2 and 3, and the worst case, a more significant fall in units following on. Okay, let's see what else we have in terms. Oh, hi, Cookie Boy. Nice to see you. Hope you're doing well. And thank you very much for all your support with the data that you continue to supply to us. It's really appreciated. Really helps to make the show work really well. Now, MD asked for 4670. So let's put that one in. 4670. So this is the location of Bundaberg in Queensland. And here we have 35,000 households with 39% owning outright and 30% borrowing, 29% renting. Mortgage stress at 20%, rental stress at 89%, stressed investors 27%, giving us financial stress metric of 40.5%. That's more than 14,000 households in stress in the postcode. 83% of houses, 6.8% of units, other types of property there at 9.7. People ratio is 2.19. The vacancy rate is 8.4. So it could possibly be second homes, it could be Airbnb or a combination of those things. Gross investment yield is 4.4, net investment yield minus 0.3. Average taxable, as reported by the ATO, at 60,000. The average household census was 62,000. And that gives a disposable monthly of around 4,300, with 36%, 1,560, going on the typical mortgage, and 32.8%, 1,420, going on the typical rent. And looking at the households scenarios for prices in this postcode, best case, rise of 12.1% over 3 years. Base case, a fall of 7.2%. The worst case, a fall of 27.2%. Houses leading the way, units following on. Okay, Jeremy C. asked, is the RBA going to cut in February? As I said earlier on, good question. Not sure. They probably shouldn't from a purely economic perspective, but the question is, will they be got to by government? And of course, the media are throwing bricks at them quite hard and arguing that they should. The data was conflicting over the last month or two. I did actually make some shows on this. Employment was strong. The retail spending was quite strong. Mortgage growth is very strong too. The interest rates, of course, are putting some pressure on some households. The default rates are rising slightly. We are still seeing, of course, some households able to spend and willing to spend, others not. So it's a bit of a line ball. I think with the interest rates where they are and where the exchange rate is, it's going to be quite hard for the RBA to cut in February if they follow the pure economic path. But if they actually are more influenced, either directly or indirectly, by the politics of it and perhaps by what's happening, locally, there's an election coming on, maybe there will be a cut. But my point would be this: even if there is a cut, it probably won't be a significant cut. We're not going to see rates coming back down to 0.1. So it might be, 25, another 25 later in the year. But we're not seeing 2% off. So don't be under the illusion that we're going to go back to 0.1% as a sort of a base rate. We're not. And that's going to continue to put a lot of pressure on households. Frankly, even if rates were cut by 50 basis points, for many of these in stress that we're looking at tonight, it wouldn't necessarily be enough to make a big difference. Cookie Boy, you've asked for 2300. Let's put that one in. Cut back to the slides. Okay, so this is Cook's Hill in the Hunter. 6,166 households, 27% owning outright, 20% borrowing, 52% are renting, so a lot of rent going on, 70% in mortgage stress, 39% in rental stress, 13% in stressed investor land, and 38% in financial stress overall. We have mostly units at 60%, some houses and other types of property there too. We have a lower people ratio, 1.58, so there's probably some individuals and just couples as well as some families there. The vacancy rate's quite high at 17.8, so that could signify things like second homes, Airbnb, those sorts of things. Who knows, it could well be. Gross investment yield is 3. Net investment yield is minus 1.4%. So that's a lot of negativity in terms of the rental returns. And the average taxable is 100,000. That's from the ATO. The census was 100,512, so very, very close. That gives a disposal monthly around $7,500, with 35.4% going on the typical mortgage and 28.8% going on the typical rent. And looking at the best case scenario, still a rise of 11% over the next 3 years. But the base case, which I think is probably, somewhere between best and base, is probably where I would pick we're going to end up, down 8.4%. So the growth is not necessarily guaranteed. And if the worst case scenario came through, then that would be down 28% over 3 years, units following on. Okay, what else have we got? Okay, Wednesday Brown said 3041 Strathmore. Sure. 3041. Okay, this is in districts of Melbourne. The SA3 is Moreland. And the LGA is Moonee Valley. 5,200 is there, with 37% earning outright, with 37% borrowing and 25% renting. And you can see here mortgage stress at 74%, rental stress at 61%, stressed investors at 24%. So financial stress, 53%. That's one of the highest we've seen so far. You can see that from a property mix perspective, houses at 64%, units at 16%, other types of property 18%. People ratios on the high side, 2.39, so that'll be some families as well as individuals. The vacancy rate was 8.5%. The gross investment yield is 3.5. The net investment yield is negative. Unfortunately, across a lot of Melbourne, it's negative, minus 0.5%. The average taxable from the ATO, 91,200. And the census said 113,000. Multi-flag suggests multiple incomes going on the mortgage. And that gives a disposal monthly around 7,200 with 39.2% on the mortgage, 2,860, and 26.7%, 1,948 a month going on the typical rent. From a scenario perspective, no real good news. Even the best case scenario, it's hard to see prices rising, maybe 1.6% down over the next 12 months and 5% over the next 3 years. The base case, a more significant fall, and the worst case, a dramatic fall. Again, I think we're somewhere between best and base. So to my mind, Melbourne over the next year or so, we're going to see more falls rather than rises. Okay, Gavin Lang says, hello DFA, such wonderful analysis. Glad you like it. Can you cover 2444 and 3350? Sure can. Well, let's start with 2444, shall we? I'm glad you appreciate the analysis and all the work that goes into it. There's a lot goes on to be able to make this all work. But it is quite powerful. And as you start seeing different postcodes, you can begin to understand the different dynamics that are going on. So let's look at 2444 to start with. And 2444 is Port Macquarie, 22,500 households, 40% own outright, 27% are borrowing, and 31% are renting. Mortgage stress at 38%, rental stress at 90%. Stressed investors at 19.4% and overall financial stress at 44%. 67% are houses, 14% are units, and the other types of property 18%. The people ratio is just over 2. So that may suggest some households, maybe some individuals and some couples there too. At 9% vacancy rate, 3.3% is the gross investment yield. But again, the net investment yield is negative 0.8%. And I'm afraid I'm seeing this trend more and more with investors losing money on a cash flow basis. So it's all down to whether they're going to see capital appreciation or not. Taxable, as reported by the ATO, this is in the year 21-22, 64,600. The census data from the earlier census in 2021 was 67,909. So relatively similar. Gives us a disposal monthly around 4,700 with 45% going on the mortgage. Ooh, that's high, 45.5% actually, 2,160. And 40%, 1,918, going on the typical rent. We are unfortunately seeing some households in some places with more than half of the disposable monthly income going on the mortgage now, so that's a real problem. Looking at the scenarios, you can see there that the best case scenario is a rise of 7% over 3 years cumulatively. The base case, a fall of 11% over 3 years cumulatively. Worst case, a more significant fall on units, following along somewhat similar. Now, you also asked for 3350. Let's put that one in. This is Ballarat. Ballarat is one of those on my list. And you can see there that 28,000 households with 32% owning outright, 30% of borrowing and 33% of renting. Mortgage stress, well, this is a real high one, 88.2% in mortgage stress, 81.8% in rental stress, 24% in stressed investor land. And that gives a financial stress metric of 62.2%, which is extremely high. That's why this particular postcode is on my top list. 84% of houses, 3.3% of units, and 12% of other types of property. The PP ratio is 2.15. Vacancy rate, 8.1%, time of census. Gross investment yield, 3.1%. Net investment yield, minus 1%. So another example of people losing money on investment properties. Taxable income, 70,000. Household census at 78,000. And that gives a disposal monthly around $5,800, with 31.3% going on the typical mortgage. And the rent, 25.7%, $1,495. And I will make the point that quite often what we see is these lower percentages, but nevertheless high levels of stress in some of these postcodes where the income, disposable monthly income, is on the lower side. That's quite consistent with what we see in the modeling. Okay. Luca asked for 3087. This is Watsonia. And somewhat small account. 38% own outright, 39% of borrowing, 22.6% of renting, 90% in mortgage stress, 80% in rental stress, 14.5% in investor stress, and the overall financial stress metric at 54%. So again, above 50. 90% are houses, some units, and other types of property. People ratio is high at 2.42, so this is going to be families included. 5.4% vacancy rate. Gross investment yield, 2.7. Net investment yield is minus 1.4%. That's very high. Again, unfortunately, I'm seeing this in a lot of Melbourne suburbs. Average taxable from the ATO, 73,000. The household census gave a household income of 102,000. So the multi-flag comes up, multiple incomes going on the mortgage. Gives a disposal monthly around $7,200 a month, with 32.9% or 2,444 going on the typical mortgage, and 26.2% at 1,944 going on the typical rent. From a scenario perspective, best case, still a fall, maybe a couple of percent over the next 12 months, but a more significant cumulative fall over 3 years of, say, 7%. Base case, a 26% fall over 3 years, and 47% if that were to happen. Well, worst case scenario, very significant units following on. Okay, what else have we got? Okay, yeah, well, let's look at this one for a bit. What are your thoughts on the declining quality of new homes? Yes, this is a big deal. I've been talking about this for quite some time. And in fact, building standards, it's bad in high-rise land, but it's also bad in low-rise land as well. There's three reasons. Firstly, the quality of materials being imported into the country are quite low. They're not necessarily being inspected on the way in. Some of those could include, for example, asbestos sheeting. And unfortunately, some of that then gets put into the property. Secondly, of course, they're trying to build down to a price. That means cutting corners. That means using thinner materials. That means skating as close as they can to the building regulations. Remember, of course, that a lot of the inspections are now not done from an external authority. It's done basically from somebody who is independent, quote unquote, but of course makes money from making building inspections, so they're not going to want to highlight issues. In New South Wales, where they've been doing quite a lot of work on this, they think about half of properties are probably faulty when they're first put together. The third one is, of course, the quality of the work that's being done. And in some cases, we're finding that the building firms who are under financial pressure, and indeed some have fallen quite recently, they're actually hiring people with perhaps lesser qualifications. So their own level of internal supervision is lower too. So you put building down to a price, you put rush to build, you put poor quality materials, and all of those factors mean that we've got properties with very low levels of quality. And I have to tell you, having looked at a lot of properties across Australia, some of the older properties were really built firmly and strongly with bricks, and not just bricks as facing, but bricks as structural, or a concrete block as structural. A lot of properties these days will be framed, and then they just layer up bricks on the outside in places for cosmetic reasons, not for structural reasons. The other point, of course, also is that in some parts of the country, there are specific rules and regs relating specifically to the problem of high winds, tornadoes and those sorts of things. And particularly up in Queensland, in Western Australia, the building regs are stronger. However, even there, the quality of construction overall is still not very high. So you can have a certified property in line with the local conditions, but it still is not necessarily well built. So this is why Edwin and I have been saying quite recently, it's really important to get a proper survey, a structural survey done, have a good look at a property, even if it's relatively new. Remember also that the guarantees that are provided are relatively weak. And unfortunately, there are stories where people have actually found defects, tried to get the builder to fix them, but the builder's disappeared, or they've gone through hell and high water to try and actually get the insurance claims sorted out. So it's a real mess. One of the reasons why I always caution when buying new property, whether it's high rise or low rise, it's really important to do your due diligence and make sure that you've really focused on the right things. And MD, just acknowledge that nice to see you back in the chat. Hope you're well. And Jump for Joy, you're welcome to you. Good to see you there. Okay, Bossman, 4510 you've asked for. Let's put that one up, shall we? Okay, 4510. So this is Caboolture, Brisbane and Moreton, 21,300 households, 26.7% owning outright, 35.9% borrowing, 37.4% are renting. Borrowers in stress, 13.8%. Renters in rental stress, 90.2%. Stressed investors, 22.8%. Giving households in financial stress at 43.4%. 83% of houses, small number of units on the types of property there. 2.43 is the people ratio, so again, families as well as individuals. Vacancy rate, 6.9%. Gross investment yield is 4.4%. Net investment yield is positive. Again, we are seeing some areas of Queensland where there are still small returns from investment properties, but it's becoming a bit of a rarity, in fact. Average taxable, 55,000 from the ATO. Multi-flag coming up, 68,000 from the census. And that gives a disposal monthly of about 4,646 with 41%, 1906, going on the typical mortgage, and 34.9, 1619 going on the typical rent. Just take a drink, excuse me. One disadvantage of running my own show is that I have to keep talking. Looking at the scenarios, you can see there that base case is a bit of a fall, but the best case is a rise 13.2% over the next 3 years. Worst case, a fall of 26%, units following on. Okay, yes, Cookie Boy makes the point. Many vested interests are calling for cuts. Yes, from the politics, charmers, from big business, who of course want to lend more or want to build more and get more, sell more. The vested interests, of course, have a huge weight, unfortunately. The question is, will the RBA stand up to those vested interests? I hope they do. They should. The fact of the matter is that we still have not got inflation under control. And given the forward expectations of Trump in the US and the exchange rates, chances are inflation will be high for longer. So I think there is probably an argument for saying don't lift, don't cut, stay put. But, as I said in my scenarios, all three are on the table at the moment. So we'll see. Okay. David Webster says 4300 if possible. Let's see, shall we? The only reason it wouldn't be possible is that if it's a very small postcode. No, Belwood Park is there. So this is 23,800 households. 15% are owning outright. Look at this. 46.8% are borrowing. Talk about Mortgage City. And 38.2% are renting. 55.1% are in mortgage stress. 88% are in rental stress. 16.6% are stressed investors. And 64.2% are in financial stress. 90% are houses. Small number of units and other types of property. People ratio is 2.78, so you can see there that includes some families. The vacancy rate is 6.3%. 4.4% is the growth investment yield. The net investment yield is positive 0.4%. Looking at the average taxable, 68,000 from the ATO, 105,000 from the census. The multi-flag comes up. Multiple incomes going on the mortgage. Gives a monthly disposable around $7,100 with 29.7% going on the typical mortgage and 26.6% going on the typical rent. From a scenario perspective, still potentially a rise, best case 9.2% over 3 years, base case a fall of 10% over 3 years, 2.4% over the next 12 months, worst case down 30% over 3 years if that went really badly. Philox says, hi DFA, love your channel. I'm curious about Bribey Island 4507. Thank you for your comment. Really appreciate that. 4507, let's see whether it's in. Yes, Bribey Island is indeed in. And we'll look at that. 10,000 households, 56% owning outright, 20% are borrowing, 23% are renting. Mortgage stress, a mere 11%, but rental stress, 87%. Financial stress for investors at 22% and overall financial stress, 28%. 73% are houses, 6.1% are units, 20% other types of property. People ratio is 1.7%, so maybe low, perhaps individuals. Vacancy rates, 12.1%. That's probably Airbnb, second homes, all of those things. But the gross investment yield is 4.5. Net investment yield is just positive 0.1%, so not making a huge return. 58,000 the taxable, 49,000 from the census, giving a disposal monthly of 3,405, with 58% going on the typical mortgage and 49% going on the typical rent, with a payment of 1976 and 1670. Looking at the scenarios, best case 14% rise over the next 3 years, base case a fall of 5.3%, and the worst case down 25%, and units following on. Now, Australia Truly Asia says, Martin, a snapshot of 2155, please. Yep, happy to oblige. This is Beaumont Hills in the Blacktown area. And you can see here that we have 24,300 households, 18.5% owning outright, 56.3% borrowing. I think that's the highest now, 56.3%. A lot of new purchases there. 25.1% renting, 42% in mortgage stress, 80% in rental stress, 23% in stressed investor land, and 51% of overall in financial stress. 82% are houses, more than 18,000, 10% are units, 7% other types of property. Vacancy rates, 4.4%. Gross investment yield, 3.5%. Net investment yield, minus 0.3%. Looking at the data, the average taxable was 88,000, but the household census said 158,000. So there's a multi-flag there. And that gives us disposal monthly of around 9,000 with 39.4%. 3,600 going on the typical mortgage and 32.8% at 2,998 going on the typical rent. So this is an interesting scenario where you've got higher levels of income, higher prices therefore, and overall very, very high levels of disposal monthly going on the mortgage and high levels of stress. So it is unfortunately what I would expect to see in that sort of area. Wednesday Brown says, thank you, Martin. Appreciate all your hard work. Glad to help. If it helps to cast a bit of a spotlight on some of these issues, then that's good. Craig West asks for 3060. This is Faulkner in the Tullamarine area of Melbourne. 5806 households, 37% earning outright, 31% borrowing, 31% renting, 57% in mortgage stress, 100% give or take in rental stress, 19% in stressed investor land, 51.8% in financial stress overall, with 83% of houses, small number of units, other types of property. The people ratio is 2.59, so that again is households with families included there. Vacancy rate is 8.9%. The gross investment yield is 2.9%. Net investment yield minus 0.6%. So another case where Melbourne investors underwater. Average taxable 59, household census 74, giving a multi-flag, and that gives a disposal monthly around $5,200, with 42.9% going on a typical mortgage and 35.7% going on typical rent at $2,251 a month for a mortgage and $1,873 a month going on typical rent. And looking at the scenarios, the best case scenario, a fall of a couple of percent over the next 12 months and 6% over 3 years. Base case, a fall of 25% over 3 years. Worst case, maybe even down 46% if things go really badly wrong from here. Carl says, even brilliant people, even Carl. Logan says, Ballarat in stress, crazy world. Yes, indeed. You've got to look at some of these regional areas. I am seeing, unfortunately, more and more regional areas being caught up in it at the moment. It's interesting. Cookie Boy just threw this up. The world regular pay in the UK increased 5.6% year on year in the 3 months to November, most 6 months, compared to 5.2% in the previous period, which was the lowest. Yeah, it is interesting. It is very interesting that in the UK, we're actually seeing real wages growth. It's not really happening in Australia to any major extent yet, partly because inflation is still a bit higher, and it's equally not spread. There are some areas doing quite well, others not doing so well when it comes to income growth. Okay. I did Bribey Island, I think 4507, didn't I? Let me just check that that's the same one. I think it is. And maybe that's a different one. Banksia breach. I will just, this looks a different one. Okay. Always a matter of definition, right? When you actually look at some of these. Let me just put this one up. So this is 4507 with 10,000 households, 56% lending outright, 20% borrowing, 23% renting, 11.8% in mortgage stress, 87% in rental stress, 73% of houses, small number of units and types of property. Gross investments 4.5, which is on the high side. Net investment 0.1. People ratios on the low side, so maybe individuals. Vacancy rates high, so maybe some part-time Airbnb, second home stuff going on there. 58,000 versus 49,000 from the two income comparisons, giving a disposal monthly around 3,400. 58% going on the typical mortgage, 49% going on the typical rent, 1,976 versus 1,670. And scenarios shows a rise of 14% over 3 years base case down 5.3%, worst case down 25.1% units following on. Harry H asks for Calm Vale. That's a lovely name. I wonder where that is. 4166. I learned more about Australia. Whoops. 4116. I mistyped it. Try again. Yay. Calm Vale in Sunnybank. Oh, it sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Lovely name. Very evocative. Okay, 9,200 houses there, 26% earning outright, 44% of borrowing, 29.3% of renting. My guess is it's a mortgage belt. 55% in mortgage stress, that would confirm that. 84% in rental stress, 19.8% in stressed investor land, 55.1% in financial stress, and 74%, 6,300 houses, small number of units, other types of property there. People ratio is high, 2.98, so that's going to be families as well as individuals. Vacancy rate's 4.4%. Gross investment yield is also 4.4. Net investment yield is 0.1% positive. Taxable income, 62,513 from the ATO in 21-22, 102,444 from the census, giving a multi-flag, and monthly disposable calculation of 6,528. That's, of course, after tax. 33.9% or 2210 going for the mortgage, and 32.1%, 2098 going on the typical rent. And from a scenario perspective, best case up 9% over 3 years, base case fall of 10%, worst case down 29% over 3 years, units following along. Okay, well, I'm getting a big set of requests here. I won't necessarily. Oh dear, oh dear. Hello, thank you for dropping in. Great to see you. Can I do 2200? I think I'm going to run out of time here. This is Bankston in Sydney. 15,600 with 25% owning outright, 28% of borrowing, 46% of renting, 21% in mortgage stress, 86% in rental stress, a third in stressed investor land, and the overall financial stress at 55.3. 38% of houses, 44% of units, 6% of the types of property, 8.8% the vacancy rate, it's quite high, 2.8% the people ratio, so that's going to be families, I think. Gross investment yield 3.3, net investment yield minus 1%, average taxable 52,000, household census 72,000, multi-flag up there. Disposal monthly around 5,000 with 47.1% going on typical mortgage at 2,368 and 40% 2,044 going on the typical rental. And looking at the scenarios, best case 8.4% over 3 years, base case a fall of 11% and the worst case fall of 31.5%. Otto makes the point. On the facts on the ground, don't see how a cut is justified. I agree with that. 2153, says Adrian. This is Balcombe Hills in Sydney, 22,200, 34% own outright, 45% borrowing, again, mortgage belt land, 20% of renting, and the borrowers in mortgage stress at 15.9%, and renter stress 86%, 70% stressed investors, 35% in financial stress. And looking at the mix, 75% of houses, 30% of units, and 11% other types of property. Gross investment yield is 3.3, net investment yield is minus 1.3%. Taxable income, 85,000 versus 129,000, so there's a multi-flag there, giving a disposal monthly of 7,978. 41.5% going on the typical mortgage at more than 3,300. That's pretty big and high. And 33.7 or 2,691 going on the typical rental, with the scenarios, best case up 9.7%, base case a fall of 9.9%, and the worst case fall of 29.6%. Now, I am just going to put the dogs on, and let's get rid of that. I'm just going to get a refill for my glass. I've drunk all my water and I've got a tickly throat. So just hang on and let me put the dogs up on the screen there. There we go. So the dogs will keep you company for a second. I'll be back with some more water. Just hang on. Right, I'm back. Sorry about that. Just put my glass down and it's better. Oh, dear idea. Sorry, I had a tickly throat and wasn't able to deal with it without it. Right, where are we? Okay, here we have our postcode request 2200, which is Bankstown. I've done Bankstown, I think, so that's already done. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I've done Bankstown. Here's a funny one. Hi, John. Who's John? It's Martin North here. Never mind. Not a problem. 2444. Let's put that one in. Port Macquarie. I think we did Port Macquarie earlier on, actually. But anyway, for those who missed it, I'll do Port Macquarie again. Because, of course, some people come in a bit later. 22,000 households, 40% own outright, 27% of borrowing, 31% of renting, 38% mortgage stress, 90% of rental stress, 19.4% in stressed investor land, and 44.6% in financial stress overall. 67% are houses, 14.4% are units, and 18.2% of the types of property. People ratio is just over 2. Vacancy rate is 9%, and the gross investment yield is at 3.3. Net investment yield is minus 0.8. Taxable 64 to 67, pretty close. Disposal monthly 4746. 45.5% going on the typical mortgage and 40% going on the typical rent. 2,160 versus 1,918. And the scenario perspective shows a best case of rise of 7% over 3 years, the base case of fall of 11%, and the worst case of fall of 31%. So there you are. And of course, one of the issues I always have is trying to remember which ones I've done. I should put some extra coding into the program here to be able to actually flag if I've done it. But anyway, it's easier just to do it again. Or it says, grab a cold one. Yeah, I've actually got cold fizzy water. I find that's the best thing to actually help me. When I'm on the air, I get a bit dried out, and I find that cold fizzy water is the Cookie says, how was the beer? Wish it was a beer. No. A drunk in charge of a live show is probably not a good idea. Hi, Smooth. Good to see you. Now, it's interesting. Banking is the cause of all this mess. Yeah, I have to tell you that, of course, the fact that people have been overlent has been a real issue. And, of course, the banks push that. Poor lending standards, etc. As Cookie says, record insolvencies. We're seeing that, of course, in the building and construction sector in particular. And that's another reason why the supply of properties is very much under pressure. So it is fascinating just to watch what's going on. You know, I've made a show at the end of last year called Australia is Stuffed. And that show has got more than 140,000 views. It's probably one of the best shows I've ever done in terms of ratings. And there we went into some of the details. The complexity that's created this problem, you know, bad government decisions, bad regulatory decisions, bad lending decisions, governments stoking through incentives. All of these things are coming home to roost now. And now the sad point about this is it's taken a long time to work through. They keep extending and pretending. The banks do too. But the net result of all of this is we're in a really significant maybe I look like a John. Now I've got too much hair to be John. Oh dear. Oh, it says wrong live stream. Very good. Okay, 4865. Somebody asked for. Let's put that one in. Okay, 4865. Get rid of that so you can see it. Okay, this is Gordon Vale in the far north of Queensland. 3,142, 29% owning outright, 48% of borrowing, 21.6% of renting. Mortgage stress at 52.4%, rental stress at 85.7%, stressed investors at 9.2%, and overall financial stress at 45.6%, which is pretty high, really, but below rather than above 50, of course. 96% of houses, small number of units, other types of property. People ratios 2.48, so probably families there. The vacancy rate 7.9%. Gross investment yield is 4.1. Net investment yield is minus 0.5. Average taxable 65,000 from the census, 90,000. So the multi-flag comes up again, and then you can see there that the disposal monthly is just over $6,000, with 32.5% or 1976 per month going on the mortgage, and 26.6% at 1619 going on the typical rent. From a scenario perspective, house prices up maybe 10% over 3 years. Best case, fall above 8% over 3 years. Base case, 29% fall over worst case in units following along. Okay, Glenn says 4565. Says Tawantin, which is an area I absolutely love. Been there many times. There's a very, very good antique and furniture shop in Tawantin, and I've got quite a lot of stuff from that place. Okay, 6,264 households with 44% owning outright, 33% borrowing, 22.9% renting. Mortgage stress 76.9%, rental stress 64.3%, stressed investors 3.1%, and houses in financial stress 40.7%. You can see there that 85% of houses, some units, other types of property. The people ratio is 2.12, so a little bit lower than some other areas. Vacancy rates 10.8%, maybe Airbnb, second homes, that sort of stuff. Gross investment yield is 4%. Net investment yield is 0.3. Taxable on average 60 from the ATO and 67 from the census, giving a disposal monthly of 4957, with a 44.6% going on the typical mortgage at 2210 and 44.2% at 2193 going on the typical rent. From a scenario perspective, best case up 11% over 3 years, base case a fall of 8% over 3 years, and the worst case down 27%. And you also asked for 4566. Okay, this is Noosaville. Well, again, an area I know very well. 4,000 households there, half own outright, 25% are borrowing and 23% are renting. 23% mortgage stress, 57% in rental stress, 22% in investor stress, and 25% in financial stress. 60% of houses, 10% units, 28% other types of property. The people ratio is even low, 1.69, so probably some individuals there as well as couples, families. The vacancy rate is very high, 21%. Clearly a lot of Airbnb and second home stuff going on there too. 4.5% gross investment yield, net investment yield minus 0.2%. Average taxable in this postcode, 84,000 versus 72,000 from the census, giving a disposal monthly of 4757, with half, 50.2%, going on the typical mortgage at 2389, and 51.3% or 2441 going on the typical rent. So pretty close in terms of percentages to the one we looked at previously. Excuse me. Sorry, still got my frog in my throat. Take a drink. Okay, looking at the scenarios. Best case up 16%. Base case a fall of 3%. Worst case a fall of 23% over the next 3 years. Jack and Esther says, can I do St Agnes? 5097, sure can. Don't know that St Agnes, but there's a St Agnes in Cornwall in the UK, which is lovely. Let's have a look. 5097, 5097. Yep, should be working. 5,900 households, 35% owning outright, 47% borrowing, 16.9% of renting, 22.2% in mortgage stress, 75% in rental stress, some stressed investors as well, financial stress, 25.8% overall. So, not too bad. 85% of houses, some units, and other types of property. Vacancy rates 4.6. The people ratio is 2.32. Gross investment yields 4.3. Net investment yield 0.1 positive. Taxable 60,000 from the ATO, 81,000 from the census. And that gives a disposable monthly with a multi-flag, $5,448 a month, with a third going on the typical mortgage and 30.7% going on the typical rent at $1,800 and $1,670 respectively. From a scenario perspective, best case up 16%, base case down 2.6% over 3 years, and the worst case down 22.7% over 3 years. Okay, how are we doing? Okay. Hello from Hope Valley, 5090. With 35464 property people and households in the postcode, 37% owning outright, 40% of borrowing, 21% of renting, 61.5% are in stress from a mortgage perspective, 77.1% from a rental perspective, 17% from investors' land, 46.7% in financial stress. Overall, 73.3% are houses, 2.5% of units and other types of property, 24%. 2.14 the people ratio, the vacancy rate is 5.5, the gross investment yield is 4.1%, the net investment yield is minus 0.1%, average taxable 68,000 versus 66,000 from the census, giving a disposable monthly of $4,599 a month, with 39.6% or 1820 going on the typical mortgage and 34.7% at 1595 going on the typical rent. From a scenario perspective, 10.6% rise, best case over 3 years, base case a fall of 8.9% over 3 years, and the worst case down 28% over 3 years. There we are. I did 5090, so you've got that one. $2030. 2030, that rings a bell. What's that one? Dover Heights. Very posh end of the market, as you'll see. Oh, what's happened there? Okay, there's something funny about that particular number. You see, the trouble with this one is that the disposable monthly and the taxable is all over the place. And I suspect that's because of the tax arrangements that people have in this particular one. This is a very, very affluent suburb. You can see here from the average taxable. So anyway, let's go through it. 41.5% own outright of the 5,277. 34.8% are borrowing. 23.7% are renting. Mortgage stress at 50%. Investor stress at 80%. And, rental stress at 80%. Investor stress at 40%. Financial stress at 44%. 53% of houses, some units, other types of property there. People ratios 2.49. Vacancy rates 9.6%. Gross investment yield is 3.6. Net investment yield is minus 0.9. But look at this taxable. Average individual taxable, $255,000. Household census says $181,000. Now, the fact of the matter is that quite often this is not what actually is seen in reality. So I think there's an issue here as to what people are actually telling our surveyors. I suspect they're not telling us the full story here because I don't believe this disposable monthly story here. So I'm not going to report these two figures. I don't believe them. What I can say is, though, because the stress data is calculated a different way. This is probably more realistic rather than these numbers here. Anyway, from a scenario perspective, best case, 4.9% over 3 years, base case, a fall of 14%, the worst case, a fall of 34.3%. So there we go. That's the best I can do on that one. Gregory Sweetness, thank you for doing this. You are a legend. Can I do 2035? Hopefully I can. Yeah. So this is Maroubra, the eastern suburbs, 14,300 households, 31.6 owning outright, 26.8 owning, borrowing, I should say, and 41.6% of renting, 11.1% in mortgage stress, 83% in rental stress, stressed investors at 42%, and financial stress at 49%. 34% of houses, lots of units, 45%, other types of property at 20%. You can see there the people ratio is 2.28, so that's going to be some families. And looking at the vacancy rate at 7.8%, it's quite high. Maybe some second homes, I don't know, maybe Airbnb. 3.5% gross investment yield, 0.9% negative net investment yield. So once again, we're seeing more of these areas where people are underwater from an investment perspective. Average taxable 106 versus the census 111,000, which gives a disposal monthly of 7,200, 49.7%, or $3,600 on the mortgage, and 37.2%, 2,691 going on the typical rent. From a scenario perspective, 9% best case over 3 years, base case a fall of 10%, and the worst case a fall of 30%. Well, we're ticking over past our closing time, but looks as though we are probably close to the end of the show. Anyway, as this particular comment really says, shout out to Roger Brown. This is from James. He knew what he was talking. He'd be shaking his head up there. Absolutely. Roger, absolute star. I interviewed him a couple of times. If you don't know Roger Brown, search my channel for the interviews I did with him. He unfortunately died some years ago, but he did highlight a lot of the issues that we're now seeing. And the fact of the matter is, the things are pretty amazing. And yeah, this is interesting. Australia, 255k individual taxable income. Absolutely. It's pretty amazing. And like I said, if you're in that high echelon, you can fiddle a lot. So you don't necessarily take all the data. Dawn Browning, super chat. Thank you very much for that. You've asked for 3175. We'll do that one. Make sure I put the slide back up so you can see it. Thank you very much for supporting the channel with the super chat. It is greatly appreciated. Okay, 19,300 with 29% owning outright, 29% borrowing, 41% renting, 54% in mortgage stress, 89% in rental stress, 25% in stressed investor land, and 58.3% in financial stress overall. 61% are the houses, 11.9% are units, 26.8% are other types. Of course, we're talking here Dandenong, which is one of those stressed areas. 7.9% are vacant at the moment. Well, that's from the census back in when it was done, of course. It may be different now. We can also see that the gross investment yield is 3.2%, net investment yield is underwater at 0.9%. Average taxable, 54,800. The census said 68,200, so the multi-flag is up, giving a disposal monthly around 4,978, 40.4% of $2,000, and 32.11600 on the rent. From a scenario perspective, unfortunately, best case still a fall, 5% over 3 years. Worst case down 45, the base case down 25, which gives you a bit of a flavour. James Wright said 3056. Have I done that one? Rings a bit of a bell. Let's have a look. No, Brunswick. Didn't do Brunswick. Let's do Brunswick. A nice area there. If you like the vibe. 11,900 households, 24.1% owning outright, 27% of borrowing, 48% of renting. We have mortgage stress at 55%, rental stress at 82%, stressed investors at 23.9%, and overall financial stress is 1.7%. We have the 35% houses, 34% units and rising, and 30.6% other types of property. People ratios on the low side, 1.85, so some individuals there as well as families and couples. 12.6% are vacant, 3.4% gross investment yield, net investment yield minus 0.3. Average taxable, 82,000. The census said 108,000, giving a multi-flag, giving a disposal monthly of around $7,500 a month. 34.3% or 2,587 going on the typical mortgage each month, and 29.2% or $2,198 a month going on the typical rent. From a scenario perspective, best case a fall of 4.6% over 3 years, base case a fall of 24.1%, worst case a fall of 44.2%. Okay, we are going to do one more. 4221, this is the last call today, because I'm running out of voice and running out of time. So this is Eleonora in Brisbane and Moreton Bay. And here we have 11,900 households, 32% owning outright, 38% are borrowing, 29% are renting. We have 11% in mortgage stress, 71.9% in rental stress, 18.4% in stressed investor land, and 30.3% in financial stress overall. 56% are houses, 24.8% are units, 19.2% are other types of property. We have 2.9% people ratio and a vacancy of 11.1%, which is very high. 4.4% gross investment yield, net investment yield positive 0.2. Average taxable from the ATO 76,000, from the census 89,000. The multi-flag comes up, giving a disposal monthly of around 5,913, with 42.6% going on the typical mortgage 2,520, and 37.9% at 2,243 going on the typical rent. And the scenarios are best case 16.5% up over 3 years, the base case a fall of 2.8% over 3 years, and the worst case a fall of 22.4%. So there we go. All right, that is it. So just before I close out the show, let me just do a couple of little closing remarks here. The reason I do this is because I want people to understand that there are a lot of financial pressures out there, but of course there are things that people can do. And so I always try to close the show with a little bit of positive news. So if you are interested in getting help around your mortgage or debt more generally, you can talk to the debt helpline, 1-800-007-007. This is the government-backed scheme, and they have financial counsellors who can help. They are very, very expert in helping people through. So don't just Google and try and find somewhere. Use the debt helpline. I'm also quite tickled that we used to call Roger 007. Of course, this is 1-800-007-007. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? Also, another source of information that's really useful is the AFCA Statement of Financial Position. This is a form that you can get from the AFCA website where you can put in things like your income and expenditure and other assets and your debts and all those things. It's a really useful tool for sort of ordering your thoughts, what you earn, what you owe, what your expenses are, what you own. And you can put that then into a form which you can then take to the bank or take to a counsellor to help. So that is quite a useful tool, and I do recommend using that if you need help. People need to build cash flows, understand where the money is going, and prioritise effectively. I will also just say that you can support the channel via Patreon. Some people are doing that, really appreciate that. But if you want to get the full data set for the more than 2,000 postcodes that we've been looking at today, you can subscribe via Patreon. This is in US dollars, $50 a month plus GST. And that means that you get the full set every month that you're subscribed at this tier. And for those in the Patreon program at this tier, I'll be sending the full data set out now in the next 24 hours. Right, I think I'm done. So I want to say thank you very much indeed for the conversations today. Thanks for all the requests. If you didn't manage to get your request answered, you can send me a request via my DFA blog. So if you go to the DFA blog, you'll see there's a little dialogue form on the blog, and the blog allows you to put a request in. You can do that, and I will then send you the one-page summary like we've been discussing on the show tonight. No cost, although if you'd like to make a contribution via PayPal, you're welcome to do that. We do have that facility on the website. But the point is that if you missed out simply because I ran out of time, I had loads and loads of requests tonight, it's worth, I think, getting the data. If it's useful, then that's the way you can get the data. Anyway, I am done. Thank you very much indeed for spending some time with us this evening. Just to say that next week, we're going to have a deep dive on real estate agents' fees and charges and costs and how they can be squeezed. So that should be an interesting conversation, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. You can check out my recorded shows each day of the week. We put one up every day on various matters of property and finance. We've been focusing, of course, on the use of cash quite recently with everything that's going on there. And I think that the Trump conversation will be an interesting conversation to have in a week or two when Damien's back on, when we look at the markets more broadly. So there we are. The dogs are still here. Misha did come and give me a nudge about 10 minutes ago saying, "Oi, what about lunch? We are running a bit late, but that's okay." So thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. I hope you found this useful. What I would say is, as a closing thought, that not everybody is in financial pressure. Those who are, there are things that you can do as an individual household. Get a grip on your finances, understand where the money's coming in, where it's going out, and then prioritize effectively. And some of the tools that I mentioned may well help you to escape the worst pressures. I don't think there's going to be a get out of jail card from either the government nor indeed from the RBA. So it is down to what individual households can do. And the other point, of course, is that if you are thinking of getting a mortgage for the first time, make sure that you do your sums carefully and you do take account of the fact that rates may stay high for quite a lot longer and the incomes may not grow for that long. So I think those thoughts are worth just finding away. Anyway, thank you very much for spending time with us this evening. Hope you have a good evening, and I look forward to seeing you on the next show. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Take care.